I spent 15 years proving that near-death experiences were nothing more than brain chemistry. Neurons firing, oxygen deprivation, the dying brain's last desperate attempt to make sense of shutdown. I was Dr. Rafael Sousa, neuroscientist at the University Hospital of São Paulo, and I was absolutely certain that when we die, we simply stop. I never expected to have one myself. My wife, Livia, wore a silver cross and spoke of her late father waiting with Jesus. In the beginning, I found her faith charming, a beautiful naivety, like a child's belief in magic. But after 15 years of marriage, her faith stopped being charming. It became a wound I didn't know I was inflicting. I didn't mean to be cruel. I just couldn't turn off my brain. When she'd mention her father watching over her, I'd think about grief psychology and attachment theory. When she'd pray before dinner, I'd calculate the statistical likelihood of divine intervention versus random chance. I wore my white coat even at home sometimes, like armor against anything that couldn't be measured or quantified. The graying at my temples, the chronic exhaustion in my eyes from too many late nights in the lab, the wedding ring I twisted absently during her prayers, all of it screamed one message: I know better. My research into near-death experiences was supposed to be my magnum opus, the definitive proof that there's no tunnel, no light, no divine presence waiting on the other side. Just the predictable shutdown of a biological machine. I had collected over 300 testimonies, mapped them against brain scans, identified the exact moment when the temporal lobe creates the sensation of leaving the body, when the visual cortex produces the famous white light. I was so close to finishing, so close to proving that Livia's father wasn't with Jesus, that nothing survives death, that we're alone in a cold, material universe governed by physics, not prayer. I was in my lab that Tuesday afternoon, reviewing the latest batch of brain scans. Coffee-stained research papers scattered across my desk. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that sterile hospital white that erases shadows. On my monitor, I had pulled up the fMRI results from a patient who claimed to have seen Jesus during a cardiac arrest 6 months prior. The data was beautiful. Textbook temporal lobe activity. The hippocampus firing in patterns consistent with memory retrieval and confabulation. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex lighting up exactly where we'd expect to see self-referential processing and narrative construction. The brain creating a story to cope with trauma. Nothing more. Or so I told myself. I didn't know that in less than 10 minutes, my entire life's work would be dismantled. I was typing notes for my conclusion when I felt it. A tightness in my chest that wasn't quite pain. Not yet. More like a hand closing slowly into a fist beneath my sternum. I paused, touched the spot reflexively. Probably tension. I'd been working 16-hour days for 3 weeks straight. Then the hand squeezed. Pain exploded across my chest. I gasped, tried to stand, but my legs failed. The room tilted. My vision narrowed. I thought with perfect clinical detachment. Myocardial infarction, cardiac arrest. I hit the floor, phone on the desk, 3 feet away, unreachable. My brain cataloged everything even as my body failed. I heard my heartbeat rapid, irregular, then nothing. It just stopped. And I thought, this is it. 15 years of research, and now I get to test my hypothesis firsthand. There will be no tunnel, no light, no Jesus. Just the gradual shutdown of neurological function as oxygen deprivation cascades through my brain. I'll have maybe 8 to 10 minutes before irreversible damage. Someone will find me. They'll try to resuscitate. If I'm lucky, I'll wake up with mild cognitive impairment. If I'm not, I won't wake up at all. Either way, I was right. There's nothing after this, except I was still thinking. And that was the first terrifying clue that I was wrong. My heart wasn't beating. I could feel the absence of it, that terrible stillness in my chest where rhythm used to be. But my consciousness didn't fade. I wasn't drifting into peaceful darkness. I was acutely, hyper-aware of everything. The cold floor beneath me, the fluorescent lights above, the smell of coffee and antiseptic. My wedding ring pressing into my palm where my hand had clenched. This shouldn't be possible. Clinical death occurs when the heart stops pumping blood to the brain. Consciousness should cease within 10 to 20 seconds as neurons deplete their oxygen supply. I knew this. I'd written papers on this, but I was still here, still aware, still experiencing. The lab started to change, not physically. The walls didn't melt, the lights didn't dim, but there was something else now. A presence, a thickness to the air that hadn't been there before. Like the moment before a thunderstorm when the atmosphere becomes heavy with potential energy. I tried to rationalize it. Temporal lobe seizure. Hypoxia-induced hallucination. The brain's desperate attempt to maintain narrative coherence in the absence of sensory input. But even as I thought it, I knew it was wrong. This wasn't a degradation of consciousness. This was an expansion. The darkness was absolute. Total. A void so complete I lost all sense of space. And I was terrified. Not of dying, but of something deeper. I wasn't alone, and whatever was there with me. It was watching. The darkness had weight, intention. It was aware of me, pressing against my consciousness, vast and indifferent. Every intellectual certainty I'd ever held shattered in that moment. Because this wasn't my brain shutting down. This was something my brain could never create. The utter alienness of it, the sheer magnitude of the presence, exceeded anything my neurology could generate. I'd studied hallucinations. I'd analyzed thousands of subjective reports. This was different. This was real in a way that the physical world had never been real. I wanted to scream, but I had no voice. Wanted to flee, but I had no body. My consciousness was naked, exposed, and I felt the full weight of how small I was. How insignificant. How desperately, arrogantly wrong I had been about everything. Then, the light came. Then, instant, overwhelming light. It didn't burn. It filled the void with warmth not physical, but a warmth that soaked into my consciousness, comfort and terror in equal measure. Because I knew this light was not a thing. It was someone. The light began to take shape. Not form, exactly. Not the way physical objects have form, but a condensing, a focusing of presence into something I could perceive as distinct from the infinite brightness surrounding it. And as it condensed, the warmth intensified into something else. Love. Pure, undiluted, incomprehensible love that made every affection I'd ever felt in my physical life seem like a pale shadow. The kind of love that sees everything you are, every petty cruelty and selfish thought and moment of cowardice, and embraces it all without hesitation or condition. I knew. The knowing was worse than the darkness, because I had spent 15 years trying to prove he didn't exist. Jesus. Every academic paper, every dismissive comment to Livia, every confident assertion that consciousness was nothing more than electrical patterns, all of it rose up like a tidal wave of shame. I had been so certain, so smugly, arrogantly certain. The presence moved closer, or I moved closer to it. Space didn't work the way it should, but I could feel the proximity, the overwhelming nearness of something infinitely greater than myself, and my consciousness recoiled even as it was drawn forward. The light was speaking, but not with sound, with something deeper than sound, a communication that bypassed language entirely and planted meaning directly into my awareness. And the first thing I understood, the first thing that cut through my terror and shame, was my name, Raphael. Not spoken, known, recognized, seen. My intellectual armor, my PhD and my publications and my 15 years of research, all of it dissolved like mist in sunlight. I was naked before this presence. Every defense I'd ever constructed, every rationalization I'd hidden behind, stripped away in an instant. And the presence wasn't angry. It was patient, gentle, waiting. My consciousness formed words. This can't be real. This can't be neurological. But every sense insisted otherwise. This wasn't oxygen deprivation or temporal lobe seizures. It was more real than anything I'd ever experienced. My neuroscience training screamed in protest, demanding I categorize this, but no mechanism could account for this magnitude of presence. My final coherent thought before everything I thought I knew collapsed entirely was both a confession and a surrender. This can't be neurological. And the light, the presence, the one I had denied existed for 42 years, held me in perfect, patient love, waiting for me to understand. The light didn't speak in the way human mouths form words. It was deeper than sound, more fundamental than language. It moved through me like knowledge arriving fully formed, like memory I'd somehow always possessed but never accessed until this moment. And it spoke my name. Raphael, not Dr. Sousa, not the neuroscientist, not the researcher who'd published 17 papers on consciousness. Just Raphael, the person I'd buried under credentials and intellectual armor, and the desperate need to prove I wasn't afraid of the darkness waiting at the end of everything. The person I'd stopped being somewhere along the way. I want to tell you that I responded with dignity, with the scientific composure I'd cultivated over 2 decades of academic rigor. I want to tell you I maintained some shred of the skeptical authority I'd wielded like a weapon against everyone who dared suggest there was more to existence than neurons firing in predictable patterns. But I didn't. What happened next stripped me of every defense I had. I shattered, because the presence that spoke my name knew me, not the surface facts anyone could read in my curriculum vitae or my published research. It knew the Raphael who woke at 3 in the morning, convinced that consciousness was just an elaborate trick played by evolution, that love was oxytocin and dopamine, that death was the absolute end and every moment of beauty or meaning I'd ever experienced was just biochemistry pretending to be something more. It knew the Raphael who was terrified of that truth, the one I'd never admitted existed, even to myself. Why do you fear death so much, Raphael? The question arrived without judgment, without the intellectual condescension I'd grown so accustomed to deploying against Livia's quiet faith. It was gentle, patient, the way you'd ask someone you loved why they'd been hurting themselves all these years. And I realized, standing in light that shouldn't exist according to every principle of physics I'd ever studied, that I didn't have an answer that made sense anymore, because I'd built my entire professional identity on proving that death was just neural cessation, that near-death experiences were predictable hallucinations produced by dying brains desperately trying to make sense of system failure. I'd published papers on it, presented at conferences, built a career on the intellectual certainty that consciousness couldn't survive the death of the brain. But if I was right, if death really was just the light switch flipping off forever, then every moment I'd spent with Livia, every sunrise I'd watched from our bedroom window, every breakthrough in my research that made my heart race with discovery, every single thing that made life feel like it mattered, was ultimately meaningless. Just temporary electrical patterns and temporary meat, destined for permanent oblivion. I feared death because I'd convinced myself nothing survived it. And I couldn't bear the thought that everything I loved, everything I was, would simply cease to exist as if it had never been. Jesus didn't respond with words. He showed me my life, not my achievements, but the moments I'd dismissed. Livia, 17 years ago, in the hospital chapel, rosary in hand, praying for her dying father. I'd comforted her, even though I'd condescendingly explained days earlier that prayer was just a coping mechanism. She loved me anyway, married me knowing I thought her beliefs were beautiful delusions. And I'd never once considered that maybe, just maybe, I was the one who was wrong. I saw a night 5 years ago, 2 a.m. She was awake, Bible on her lap, praying for me. I'd mocked her, joking that prayer wouldn't advance science. She closed the Bible without a word. I never saw her tears in the darkness. I saw the morning she asked if I would come to Easter Mass. Just once. I refused, citing a fake deadline. The hurt in her eyes before she smiled and said she understood. She'd gone alone, worn the dress I loved, sat in the pew and prayed for the man who couldn't even give her 3 hours of his time to honor the faith that sustained her. And I'd spent that Easter morning in my lab, surrounded by brain scans of people who claimed to have encountered God, systematically documenting why their experiences were neurologically explainable, building intellectual walls against the very possibility standing before me now. The shame was physical, crushing. I wanted to collapse under the weight of it, to disappear into the light and never have to face what I'd done. Not just the dismissiveness, though that was bad enough, but the pride. The arrogant certainty that my intelligence made me superior to her faith. The way I'd used science as a weapon to avoid the vulnerability of admitting I might not have all the answers. The way I'd wounded the woman I loved because acknowledging her truth would mean confronting my terror. But Jesus didn't leave me drowning in shame. He showed me what Livia saw, not the arrogance. She saw the 19-year-old boy who lost his mother to cancer and decided God wasn't worth believing in. She saw the man who brought her coffee every morning, who held her hand in grief. She saw the person I could be. I'd never deserved her. And she'd loved me anyway. The light around me intensified, and I understood this was the moment. The question I'd been running from my entire adult life, presented not as intellectual debate but as existential choice. Raphael, do you want to stay here or return? The peace was overwhelming. If I stayed, the fear would end. Just light, just truth. But I'd never get to tell Livia I was wrong. Never get to look into those warm brown eyes and confess that her faith wasn't naivete, that her prayers weren't psychological theater, that everything I'd dismissed as beautiful delusion was more real than any brain scan I'd ever analyzed. Never get to love her the way she deserved to be loved, with the intellectual humility to honor her truth and the spiritual openness to share it. And I understood, with clarity that bypassed every doubt, that this was why I'd been given this encounter. Not to prove my research wrong, though it had. Not to satisfy my scientific curiosity, though the neuroscientist in me was reeling from the impossibility of continued consciousness after clinical death. But to break through the pride that had kept me isolated in intellectual certainty, separated from the woman whose love had sustained me even when I couldn't see it. To bring me home to her, to us, to the truth we could finally share. I want to go back. The words, the thought, the decision formed simultaneously. And in the moment I made the choice, I felt something I'd never experienced in 42 years of existence. Absolute certainty that I was making the right decision. Not because I'd analyzed it logically or weighed the empirical evidence, but because I knew, in the same fundamental way I knew the presence before me was real, that Livia was waiting, that our story wasn't finished, that I had work to do that only I could do. Testimony to give about the 8 minutes that changed everything. Then go, Raphael. Tell them what you've seen. Tell them that love is the only thing that survives death, because love is the only thing that's truly real. And tell Livia I heard every prayer. That was the last thing I heard before the universe shifted again. The light began to recede, or maybe I was moving away from it. The peace remained, but it was changing. Becoming something I could carry back into the world of blood and neurons and hospital fluorescent lights. Not the overwhelming totality of the divine presence, but an echo I could hold on to. Proof that I hadn't imagined this. That it wasn't the predictable hallucination my research would have diagnosed. That it was real. More real than anything I'd ever known. The darkness returned, but it wasn't terrifying anymore. I could feel my body now. The physical weight I'd forgotten existed during those timeless moments in the light. Could feel pain, which meant I was alive. Could hear sounds, rhythmic and mechanical and blessedly, impossibly familiar. The beep of a heart monitor, the hiss of a ventilator. Voices, urgent and professional, calling out medical terminology I'd used 1,000 times in my career, but never expected to hear applied to my own failing body. We've got sinus rhythm. He's back. Hands on my chest, tube removed, burning oxygen. My brain cataloged the sensations, but my soul focused on one thing. Finding Livia. My eyes opened. Harsh fluorescent light. And there, face streaked with tears, was my wife. She was in scrubs, wearing her silver cross, the one I'd privately called a security blanket for adults who needed fairy tales. Now, I couldn't stop looking at it, because I'd met him, the one that cross pointed toward, and he'd known my name. Livia's hand found mine, and her touch was exactly as I remembered from the moment in the light when Jesus showed me how she saw me. Gentle, patient, full of love I'd never earned but received anyway. Her voice was shaking. Raphael, can you hear me? I could hear her, could feel the wetness on my own face that meant I was crying, could taste salt and antiseptic and the coppery tang of blood from the intubation, could smell her perfume, the one she'd worn since we were dating 17 years ago, and underneath it the distinctive scent of pediatric ward hand soap. Every sense was overwhelmed with the physical reality of being alive, of having a body, of existing in time and space and linear causality again. But all I could think about was how to possibly put 8 minutes of eternity into words she'd understand. How to tell her that everything she'd believed, everything she'd prayed for, everything I'd dismissed as intellectual weakness, was more real than the neurons I'd spent my career studying. My throat was raw. I was wrong, Livia. I met him. He's real. She stared at me. Then her face crumpled, sobbing, gripping my hand. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I knew she wasn't talking to me. The next few hours were a blur of medical procedures and neurological assessments and my colleagues running tests to determine if the 8 minutes of clinical death had caused brain damage. Irony of ironies. They were using the same diagnostic protocols I had helped develop to study consciousness in near-death experience patients. I let them run their tests. Let them document the data. Let them exchange looks that said they were worried about their colleague who'd suffered cardiac arrest and was now claiming he'd met Jesus during the neurologically predictable hallucination phase of oxygen deprivation. I would have made those same assumptions 8 minutes ago, but I knew what they didn't. Knew what their brain scans and neurological models couldn't capture. That consciousness wasn't just emergent complexity in neural networks. That love wasn't just oxytocin and dopamine. That the fear of death I'd spent decades running from had been based on the catastrophic error that nothing survived the end of brain function. I'd been wrong about everything that mattered. And Livia, my beautiful, patient, faithful wife who'd prayed for me in the darkness while I mocked her faith, had been right all along. Alone in the ICU, I told her, about the light, about seeing our marriage through Jesus' eyes. He heard your prayers, Livia, every single one. She smiled through tears. I'm so sorry, I said, for making you feel small, for using science as a weapon. You don't have to apologize. She squeezed my hand. I knew who I married, but I hurt you, and you loved me anyway. Love isn't about deserving, Raphael. It's about choosing. I chose to believe you'd find what you were looking for. I laughed, wincing. I spent 15 years trying to prove this was all hallucinations. Turns out, I was catastrophically wrong. She studied my face, and I could see the question forming before she asked it. What happens now, with your research? I didn't have to think about the answer. It arrived fully formed, the same way Jesus' words had arrived during the encounter. I'm going to keep studying consciousness, but not to disprove divine encounters anymore. To document them. To help people understand that what they experience during near-death states isn't hallucination or brain chemistry. It's real. More real than the physical world we think is so solid and permanent. I took a breath, sure of my path. And I'm going to tell my story. Not in academic papers that get peer-reviewed by other skeptics, but anywhere people will listen. Because if a neuroscientist who spent his entire career proving God didn't exist can meet Jesus during 8 minutes of clinical death, maybe other skeptics need to hear that. Livia whispered, You really met him? I did. And he's nothing like I expected. He knew my name. He knew my fear. And he sent me back with a message. Love is the only thing that survives death. So that's what I'm doing now. Telling you. I died for 8 minutes. Every principle of neuroscience said I should have ceased to exist. But I didn't. I expanded. I encountered absolute truth. Jesus is real. Love is eternal. If you're a skeptic like I was, I understand. I built a career on certainty, but truth doesn't need your belief to be real. I met Jesus whether I believed in him or not. We survived death. Consciousness continues. And on the other side, there's a light that knows your name, a love waiting for you to come home. That's why I'm not afraid anymore, because I know the end isn't the end. It's just the beginning.